It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Willow Creek, the kind of day where the sun hung lazily in the sky, and the streets were almost too calm. But beneath that calm surface, something was about to happen that would shake the town to its core. A black SUV rolled slowly down the main road, its windows tinted, giving no hint of who was inside. Behind the wheel sat General Marcus Hayes, a decorated Army officer with over 2 decades of service. He was a man who had faced enemy fire, led troops into battle, and earned the respect of everyone who served under him. But today, he was just a man driving home, unaware that his life was about to take a dramatic turn. As the SUV approached a stop sign, a police cruiser pulled up behind it. The officer inside, a man named Deputy Carl Riggs, had been patrolling the area, looking for anything out of the ordinary. To him, the black SUV with tinted windows seemed suspicious. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and siren, signaling for the driver to pull over. General Hayes, confused but compliant, eased his vehicle to the side of the road. He had no reason to believe this routine stop would be any different from the others he'd experienced over the years. But as he stepped out of the car, hands raised in a gesture of cooperation, he could feel the tension in the air. Deputy Riggs approached cautiously, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the tall, broad-shouldered man before him. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, and his instincts, shaped by years of bias and prejudice, kicked in. "Stay where you are," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. General Hayes froze, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. He knew better than to make any sudden movements, but he also knew he had done nothing wrong. "Officer, I'm General Marcus Hayes," he said calmly, his deep voice steady. "I'm just heading home. Is there a problem?" But Deputy Riggs wasn't listening. His mind was already racing, filling in gaps with assumptions that had no place in reality. He saw a black man in an expensive car, and his biases took over. "Hands where I can see them," he shouted, his voice rising with each word. Before General Hayes could respond, the officer drew his gun, pointing it directly at him. The world seemed to slow down as the two men stood there, locked in a moment of unbearable tension. For General Hayes, it was a surreal experience. He had faced danger before, but never like this. Never in his own country, from someone who was supposed to protect and serve. The sound of the gun being drawn echoed in the quiet street, and a few passers-by stopped in their tracks, unsure of what to do. General Hayes's mind raced. He knew he had to stay calm, but the injustice of the situation burned in his chest. "Officer," he said again, his voice firm but controlled, "I am a United States Army general. I am not a threat to you." But Deputy Riggs wasn't hearing any of it. His finger hovered near the trigger, his eyes darting between the man before him and the car behind him. He was convinced he was in danger, and nothing General Hayes said could change his mind. As the standoff continued, the tension grew thicker. General Hayes could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew that one wrong move could end in tragedy, and he wasn't about to let that happen. But how could he defuse the situation when the officer refused to listen? The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, something happened that changed everything. A voice rang out from the crowd that had begun to gather, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Put the gun down, Riggs. Do you even know who you're pointing that at?" The voice belonged to Sheriff Linda Carter, a no-nonsense woman who had been with the department for over 20 years. She had been driving by when she saw the commotion and immediately recognized General Hayes. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. She knew Deputy Riggs had a history of jumping to conclusions. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. As she stepped out of her car, her badge glinting in the sunlight, she moved quickly to intervene. But would she be in time? And even if she was, what would happen next? The damage had already been done, and the fallout from this moment would ripple through the town, and through both men's lives for years to come. As the crowd watched in stunned silence, the tension reached its breaking point. General Hayes stood tall, his eyes locked on Deputy Riggs, while Sheriff Carter positioned herself between them, her hands raised in a plea for calm. But the question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. How had it come to this? And what would happen next? The answers to those questions would come later. But for now, the only thing that mattered was the standoff playing out on that quiet street in Willow Creek. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome was anything but certain. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the scene, one thing was clear. This was a moment that would change everything. Sheriff Linda Carter's voice cut through the air like a whip, sharp and commanding. "Riggs, lower your weapon. Now." Her tone left no room for argument, but Deputy Riggs hesitated, his grip tightening on the gun. His eyes darted between the sheriff and the man he still saw as a threat. For a moment, it seemed like he might not listen, like the tension might snap into something irreversible. But then, slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the gun, though his finger remained near the trigger. The crowd that had gathered let out a collective breath, but the relief was short-lived. The situation was far from over. General Hayes remained calm, his hand still raised, his posture steady. He had been in high-pressure situations before. War zones, diplomatic negotiations, life-or-death decisions. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his own country, a place where he had served and sacrificed for decades. And yet, here he was, standing on the side of the road, treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but he knew better than to let his emotions take over. He had to stay composed, for his own sake and for the sake of everyone watching. Sheriff Carter stepped closer, her eyes locked on Deputy Riggs. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce. Riggs flinched, his confidence wavering under her glare. I thought he was a threat," he stammered, his voice shaky. The tinted windows, the car. It looked suspicious. Sheriff Carter shook her head, her frustration evident. "You didn't even give him a chance to explain himself," she said, her tone heavy with disappointment. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Riggs glanced at General Hayes, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. He didn't know, and that was the problem. General Hayes took a deep breath, lowering his hand slowly. "Sheriff," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I appreciate your intervention, but this isn't just about me. This is about how we treat people, how we see them, or don't see them." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "Sheriff," Carter nodded, her expression grim. She knew he was right. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that had been festering for far too long. But addressing that problem would have to wait. Right now, they had to deal with the situation at hand. The crowd that had gathered was growing larger, their murmurs filling the air. Some were recording the scene on their phones, while others simply watched in stunned silence. News of what had happened would spread quickly, and Sheriff Carter knew they had to act fast to prevent things from escalating further. "General Hayes," she said, turning to him, "I'm deeply sorry for what's happened here today. This is not how we do things in Willow Creek, and it's certainly not how we treat someone who has served our country with honor." Her words were sincere, but they did little to ease the tension. The damage had already been done. Deputy Riggs stood awkwardly to the side, his face flushed with embarrassment and shame. He had acted on instinct, driven by biases he hadn't even realized he had. And now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he didn't know what to do. I didn't mean to," he started, but his voice trailed off. There was no excuse for what he had done, and he knew it. Sheriff Carter turned to him, her expression stern. "We'll discuss this later," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Right now, we need to focus on de-escalating this situation." As the sheriff worked to calm the crowd and ensure everyone's safety, General Hayes took a moment to collect his thoughts. He had always known that racism existed, even in the military, but he had never expected to experience it so blatantly, so personally. It was a stark reminder that, no matter how much he had achieved, no matter how many medals he had earned, there were still people who would judge him based on the color of his skin. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it also strengthened his resolve. He knew he had to use this moment to make a difference, to shine a light on the issues that so many people preferred to ignore. But before he could do that, he needed to get through the next few minutes. The crowd was still restless, their emotions running high. Some were angry, demanding justice for what they had just witnessed. Others were scared, unsure of what would happen next. Sheriff Carter did her best to reassure them, but it was clear that this incident had struck a nerve. Willow Creek was a small town, and news traveled fast. By tomorrow, everyone would know what had happened, and that meant there would be consequences. For Deputy Riggs, for the sheriff's department, and for the town as a whole. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the scene, General Hayes made a decision. He stepped forward, addressing the crowd in a calm, steady voice. "I know you're all upset," he said, his words carrying the weight of his experience and authority. "And you have every right to be. What happened here today was wrong, but how we respond to it matters just as much as the incident itself. We can let this divide us, or we can use it as an opportunity to come together and make things right." His words resonated with the crowd, and for a moment, the tension seemed to ease. But the underlying issues remained, simmering beneath the surface. Sheriff Carter watched him speak, her respect for the man growing with every word. She knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be investigations, meetings, and difficult conversations ahead. But for now, they had managed to avoid a tragedy. And that was something. As the crowd began to disperse, she turned to General Hayes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for your composure, your leadership. Not many people could have handled that the way you did." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I just hope this can be a turning point," he replied, "for all of us." But, as they stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on them, both knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. The incident had exposed deep-seated issues that couldn't be ignored, and addressing them would require more than just words. It would require action, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And as the first stars began to appear in the evening sky, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The real challenge, the real work, was just getting started. And no one knew yet how it would end.